All right. I think most of the participants have been able to file in. I know Zoom likes to open the door a little wide and wider as we go. And so if you're a participant, you're going to be able to ask questions in the Q&A. So feel free to chime in, and if it's an embarrassing question, you don't want me to read your name out loud, just choose the anonymous option. But otherwise, I am so excited that after about a month delay, we've been able to get this put together through the amazing skills of Megan O'Neill and Emily Dreyfuss, who really stepped up to support me on this. Megan's the program coordinator on the TaSC project. I'm Joan Donovan, the research director at Harvard Kennedy Shorenstein Center and the director of the Technology and Social Change Research Project at Shorenstein. And Shorenstein is, as of late, just kind of running wild on the internet. I mean, we've got some great events coming up. This one, as well as tomorrow, we've got a forum event, and it features Marty Barron and Cornell West Brooks, as well as the head of the Shoah Foundation, where we're going to be talking about technology and archiving and anti-Semitism in particular. And so it's going to be a really interesting conversation tomorrow. If you sign up for that, you can find the information on the Shorenstein Center website. But today we're going to be talking about tips for academics talking to journalists. And I couldn't be more pleased with the stellar panel of journalists that we've brought on to talk to us about anything and everything that might improve our our game as academics. I get quoted a lot, but I also don't get quoted a lot. So it's kind of up to the journalist to decide if there's something that I've said that's quippy enough, that fits with the context of the story, that helps illuminate things, to decide if I get in or not to a story. But we're going to talk about why that happens. We're going to talk about what it means to be on background. We're going to talk about what it means to be on the record and off the record. We're going to discuss, how to give good quotes. We're going to talk a little bit about pet peeves that journalists and academics have. And so I will be asking for your participation throughout this journey that we're on. And I also have the chat open in case I need it. But let me introduce Emily, who has been on the TaSC team now for a year, although it's all been pandemonium time. And so we've been working far afield, but very closely day by day. And she's also a journalist who covers the impacts of technology on society with a focus on social media and information systems. She was a 2018 Neiman Berkman Klein Fellow, formerly a senior editor at Wired and the editorial director of Protocol. And right now, she's the senior editor on this technology and social change project, where we primarily do outputs related to mediamanipulation.org and our casebook project. But Emily is also going to be heading up our news leaders program, which we're going to announce soonish, I hope. We've got a really great cohort of first folks that are going to come in and listen to us ramble on about media manipulation, disinformation campaigns, and what it means to do the news in this day and age. As well, we have Michelle Loxton, who's a radio journalist. So we're going to be talking a little bit about what it means to talk for radio versus print. And is currently based in Monterey, California, working at NPR station KAZU. KAZU? They don't do that, do they?
No.
No,
KEZU,
so. Yeah. Michelle has worked in news and radio talk stations for almost 10 years as a reporter, host, producer, and newscaster. And her career started in her home country of South Africa before moving to the US in 2018, where she spent almost 5 years working in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates. And she's always been a local news journalist covering the diverse issues and stories that are important to the community she has lived in. So local, but with NPR. So this is going to be exciting. And Mario Aguilar is a reporter currently covering technology, how technology is transforming healthcare at STAT. So wicked easy task, I'm sure. It's like super easy beat to be on, what is technology doing for and of and about health and public well-being. Previously worked at Gizmodo, Protocol, CNN Business, and Wired, and he's a graduate of Wesleyan and Columbia J School. And so we can even talk a little bit about what it means to go to J School and what you learn there, because I never went, but I certainly guest lectured at enough J schools. So I'm gonna say welcome and thank you all for coming. This is great, and we're just gonna have a conversation, and then we'll get to questions once they start rolling in. I wanted to open by telling an embarrassing story, though, because I feel like one of the ways that we learn from each other is we talk about the things we did 10 years ago that are embarrassing to this day. So back in November 2011, a little bit of scene setting. I'm a sociologist doing my PhD over at UC San Diego, living in LA, and I decide that I'm going to do my dissertation research on the Occupy movement. But I'm kind of waiting for a moment where it's not the camps. I'm waiting for the whole thing to fall apart, so that I can conduct research essentially on how a social movement that begins with all of this storm and bluster online either does or doesn't come back into some shape or form once that moment has passed, where everybody's really interested in what everybody's doing. And so in 2011, if you can imagine, the Occupy movement's got thousands and thousands of people are living in public parks. Now it doesn't make a lot of sense to describe it, I'll tell you. But then you really thought you were making a difference by showing up in public and being part of something bigger than you were, and you were making a lot of decisions, you were pressuring city councils, you were part of something global. And in late November 2011, of course, the talk in the US was all about how mayors were starting to crack down on occupations, and city police forces were being used essentially to, under the cover of night, just sweep up occupiers, hundreds at a time, put them all in jail, get them hemmed up on charges, make it harder for them to be back outside in public because they know that they're going to get arrested. And me, just being someone there, the reporter approaches me and I'm just like, oh, hey. And so the reporter starts talking to me, says, you want to do an interview with Al Jazeera? I'm like, sure, I'm here, you're here, let's chat. So we get into a big conversation. And it's all about the LAPD is given 72 hours notice for the Occupy LA to disappear. There are lawyers involved, the Occupy encampment's trying to figure out how it's going to handle this eviction. And all of the things that I say to this journalist, all the smart sociological insights that I offer up, history, connections back to 1968 and the situationist movement. I'm just like, oh man, this article is just going to be so much better for what I have said over these last few hours that we've been chatting and talking. And then I get one quote in it, because it's all about what's happening right at that moment. It's not about history. It's not about what I know. And it's the final quote in the article. The last paragraph is, to the members of Occupy LA, eviction was inevitable. It was just a matter of when. In previous conversation, Ms. Donovan had pragmatically stated, the city and LAPD are only with us until they are against us. That's my entire quote. And then it says, on November 23rd, Jim Lafferty, director of the National Lawyers Guild and a negotiator on behalf of Occupy LA, walked out of a meeting with representatives from the mayor's office and the LAPD. He then announced that the city of LA will soon be closing the area outside of City Hall and evicting those occupying it. So all that time I spent, all that context I had given, I made myself a little bit of an enemy with the LAPD, right? That's what I get quoted as saying, is that I'm like some tough broad out here just being, not a lot of context about who I am or whatnot. But I said something short, pithy, to the point, honest, and I got quoted. Would I have preferred not to be on the record on that? Well, I was a little nervous walking back downtown because it wasn't like they didn't know who everybody was at the encampments by that mark. I was about 60 some odd days into causing shenanigans in LA. But I say that story just because I can reflect on it now, knowing what I know about news gathering and about journalist practice and how it's different from what I do in academia. But at the moment, I was mad. I was like, what? I gave so much time and energy and effort and insight, and all they cared about was today. But it's a good written article, exactly to the point. No qualms reading it today, authentic. But it was a bit of a shock, and so I'd love to get your reactions to that. If you were on assignment in 2011, roaming around Occupy LA, and you see this chubby broad with a camera walking around, what's the approach? What's the story?
Well, I have some questions for you, Joan. Did the reporter give you a sense of what the story was that they were working on?
Yeah, I just ignored it.
Yeah. Okay. So I feel like this story demonstrates often a lot of times that there's like a mismatch between what the reporter is looking for and what the academic thinks they're being asked. Sometimes that's really on the journalist. Like if the journalist hadn't explained, hey, I'm writing a story today about the evictions. It's going to be 800 words and it's publishing this afternoon. You may have thought they were doing like a long form feature about Occupy and all of the ways in which Occupy was going to unravel. So like in some sense, it's incumbent upon journalists to give experts enough understanding of what they're working on. And sometimes, and especially in a case like that, where like you're in a breaking news event, kind of, I mean, that Al Jazeera reporter was there to report on a discrete news event. They may not know exactly what the story is. Like that's why they're asking so many questions, because they're trying to figure it out. But also, it sounds like you charmed the pants off this person, made them realize you were incredibly smart, and then you said something that happened to be really personal, really clever, because you said us. So then that they're looking for something where someone is speaking for the movement. And if we recall Occupy, no one wanted to talk for the movement. So that was a really hard quote for people to get. And not just like they were seeking that quote, but just it was hard to understand who speaks for Occupy. So there's all sorts of reasons I could imagine that journalist picking that quote, because you said us. So they're like, okay, she's part of it. And it was just clever. And it was short. And it was perfectly about the thing the article was about. And when the journalist is on a deadline for that day, if they're going to use any quote, it's going to be about the thing that this is about. That's all there's space for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm super surprised that a reporter on the street talked to you for that long. Whenever I've done that kind of a story, you're like, and I actually did it in a radio context, which Michelle can probably talk more about, but you're trying to keep it pretty short and get like 4 or 5 different people on the record and like put something together or maybe just have one small bite for a story. So I'm extremely surprised that in that context you were interviewed for that long, which I will just assume is a testament to your utter brilliance.
It could have just been I was willing, or also not very lucid when it came to something, and then he was like, all right, well, I've got a lot of stuff here. I don't know. I don't want to make it seem like I knew what I was doing, because I certainly did not.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I'm just surprised that a reporter on the street would have talked to somebody for that long, personally. But and it's also just like it's not like maybe a great example of like the context in which lots of the people who are listening to this panel are probably going to be interviewed, right? Most of them are going to be called like in their offices, under like a very set pretext. But I will say that it is extremely typical, and you'll probably hear us say different versions of this throughout, the next hour or so, which is that if you say something really strong and pithy, like that's what people are going to use. So like make sure that the strong and pithy thing you say is about what you want it to be about and not about something ridiculous. Not that you ever sound ridiculous, but not make sure that you are as strong as possible on the thing that you care the most about.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I would add to that, I'm just imagining myself in that situation with you, Joan. My editor sent me down here to this place to cover a story that, Emily mentioned, maybe I don't know that much about. And here I am on the scene speaking to someone who's telling me the history and I'm like, oh my gosh, she's going on a tangent. And often I'm thinking about, I have to turn this story for the 5 o'clock news. It's 2 o'clock. And I'm listening deeply and meaningfully, and you say something, I remember it, and I'm like, I need that clip. So it's often you're under pressure to deliver something specific, and maybe, as Emily said, maybe you weren't aware of what I was going to, that journalist was going to deliver. So yeah, it's working under a pressure as well. But that pithy quote is what we want. Yeah.
Well, let me ask you then about that scene setting, which is, are there ways that academics could better set up for, so that people can get what they need out of the interaction without going down a long historical trajectory, right? I think there are ways in which we could learn to be better communicators with each other. I know for some journalists, they'll send me an email and it will be like 3 keywords, and like I'm supposed to magically wed them together. And then I usually don't have time to do that. Sometimes I do. And if they're a young reporter just learning the beat, I will help. Especially if it's one of those panicked emails where it's like, I've just been assigned like hate speech, this white supremacist, and this Twitter trending topic. Please advise. And then I'll be like, oh. But what would you advise if someone, if you were calling someone at a university for the first time, and what kind of questions could they ask to help you get the story?
So I think this brings up for me that there are a couple different situations, right, in which a journalist will be contacting an expert like this. So the example you gave where like a new reporter contacts you because they know you're an expert in like online movements and speech and says, I don't know what to do with this, but what is the story here? In that case, they are really treating you like, this and I don't, and I want you to translate it for me. In which case, I think that's the kind of interview where having the open-ended questions and talking about the history is actually really helpful. You just need to bear in mind then that there's a tight amount of time to talk, and I would say one thing, academics should feel comfortable saying, what do you think this story is about? Like, you can ask questions to journalists when you're in a conversation, and you can say, what do you think this is about? Like, what are you actually reporting about? And then journalists will kind of show their work and think through it with you. Like, well, the reason I'm calling you is because I think that this shows that this is happening. I want a gut check. Is that what's happening? And then, you can kind of, the biggest gift that an academic can give to a journalist is telling them how they're about to get the story wrong, and like helping them fix it before they do. And one way to do that is, remember, like, you're the expert. The journalist is coming to you in this situation because they know you know more. So first you need to understand from the journalist, okay, what is their sense of the story so far? Like, how much reporting have they done? Where are they with it? And not that this needs to be long, but just get a tiny sense of it, and then say, then you in your own mind can understand, like, all right, they're about to argue this point of view in the thing. And that's something that I, as the expert, know more about. And so then you can say to them, okay, well, the classic mistake when people report on hate speech and a trending topic is that they assume X, Y, Z. And for your information, the best thing to do would be to not do that, and then you get to help them frame the story the way you want.
I would add that I don't have a lot of academics, so I do general news, so don't always talk to academics, but they don't ask any questions at the beginning of the interview, which they're welcome to do. Is like, what is this for? Is it for a newscast, which will mean I'm going to take a 6-second clip? So it would be great if you have something like that. Or is this for an in-depth feature? No one ever asks me that. I try to say that at the beginning, but a lot of journalists will not. And so maybe it would be helpful to know, particularly for radio, you know, before we get into this, what is this for?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. You know, I do a lot of, I guess what I would say, probably more talking to academics and a lot more like contextual reporting, I would say, which isn't necessarily even interviews that I'm trying to necessarily quote anybody on. Like I need somebody to explain an expansive topic upon which I know almost nothing. And I need to like have a pretty good sense of everything that's going on with it just to be confident that I can write the story that I'm doing. And so from that point of view, it's, you know, sometimes I usually set it up like I need the long view on this. Can you just tell me the last 5 years or whatever, and like a few, you know, just give me a little bit of paint the picture for me, because I don't know what I'm going for. You know, I think more experienced reporters will be better at getting, if they need a bite, at getting a bite out of you. You know, I would be mine, you know, if you don't have a lot of experience talking to reporters and you have the sense that it's going to be for like a newscast and that you need to get it to 6 seconds or 10 seconds or whatever else, I would recommend like trying to write something out in advance, or just really have a good tight statement that encapsulates sort of an opinion or even just context that people can bounce off of, because then, you know, then it's more useful to the reporter and ultimately will like probably portray your position better.
Yeah, and Joan, like going off what Mario said, and to answer your question, like what are some questions that academics can ask journalists? Well, one question academics can ask journalists is, can I say that again? I want to rephrase that. Which I often talk to people who, you know, they'll say something and the whole idea of what they said is brilliant, but we're in a conversation. So it's, you know, interrupted thoughts, or you started to say a sentence and then you go off in another direction. And I know and can sense and have talked to people who are like, I wish I had said that a little bit differently after the fact. And the truth is, like, you can totally say, after you've worked it out verbally with us in the interview, you can then say, okay, I thought of a better way to put that. That'll help the journalists too, because we want a quote that we can keep together. And I think maybe we should talk about on background, right? Because that's kind of what Mario's talking about.
Yeah, that is something I struggled with a few years ago, and this is something that comes up with academics too, because in the moment, you know, a journalist is coming to you, it's very exciting, and you don't always know if you're going to get quoted or not, but there's also things that if you want to convey them, you can say, you know, this is off the record, or you can say, is this a background interview? There are a lot of questions you can ask. So if you're asking for someone to talk to you on background and help with contextual, it's sometimes, you know, but this is the situation where it comes up for me most, which is usually that there's another academic paper out there and they want to comment on that, and they don't want a consensus comment that's like, yeah, looks good. This comes from a friend of mine down at UNC. Must be nice, right? You know, so I always ask for the data. If they're asking me to comment on data, if they're asking me to comment on an embargoed paper, then I try to read the paper as best I can beforehand. But yeah, for me, on background has always come in these embargoed situations where I'm being asked to comment on something that, in our field, that's really shaky, because people are serving out preprints and are giving out data to journalists without any peer review. It's a difficult problem. I understand why it's done, but publication by press release is not an ordinary scholarship, I guess I should say.
My number one recommendation on this is don't worry about the terminology at all, right? Just if you want to ensure that what you are going to say will not be quoted for you, just say, can you not quote me on this piece? And then wait for the journalist to agree. Or can you say, at the beginning of the conversation, you just say things like, well, can we just talk and you won't quote me? That would be sort of the equivalent of on background conversation. But all of these terms, everybody gets them confused. A lot of journalists don't even really know what they mean. And depending what newsroom you're in, they may mean slightly different things. Yeah. So it is, and that's just, it's just the nature of the beast. So I would just clarify at the very outset or before you're about to say something that you're not comfortable being quoted on, exactly what you mean. Don't say off the record, don't say on background. It sounded very good in, you know, all the movies, in Spotlight or whatever else, but that is not like, nobody really knows what that means. And it means different things to different people. So the best thing you can do is just be like, please do not quote me about this. And then the important legal aspect of this is that you should wait for the affirmative on that. There's some gray area there. If the reporter doesn't say anything, then they sort of are agreeing. But it's important to just be clear about what your desires are in every context, and then there's no confusion when something gets published.
Yeah, and to just like totally double down on that, you know, journalists are not generally out to get you. If like in some cases a journalist is calling, sometimes journalists are out to get like people who are politicians and they're trying to like, they're reporting on corruption or whatever. But in the situation in which journalists are calling academics, almost always it's because we, you know, recognize your expertise and want your help, or because we're literally calling you to report on your work, or on the work of someone that only you can comment about. So it's, you know, it's one thing is to understand that like most likely this journalist has your best interests in mind. Like it's not, they're not trying to get you. But just to understand, as Mario was saying, legally, if you want something, if you want to explain something to them, but you certainly don't want your name on it, like let's say for instance, someone has published some scholarship by press release and you find that totally distasteful and you think it's not a good article, but for like your field or whatever, you really don't want your name saying that. The very important thing to do is make sure that the reporter has agreed to whatever your terms are about talking about it. And this is the reason this comes up sometimes and people misunderstand is that if you get an email in which a reporter asks you a question and then you reply to that email with your answer, and then at the bottom of your email you say, please don't quote me on that, that's not how it works. You can't give a journalist the information and then ask them to not use the information. I mean, you can try, and some journalists will maybe respect you on it because they really understand that this is a complicated topic. But legally, the way it works is that if someone asks you something in writing and you respond in writing, you need to respond and say, ask them, can we have this be off the record first? Or I'd love to talk to you about it, but I don't want to be quoted about it. Is that okay? And then if the journalist says like, sure, then they are ethically obligated to not quote you on that. And, you know, they really won't. Like I've never met a journalist who operates to burn a source like that at all. But just in terms of protecting yourself, just know that it's not a deal until it's been agreed on.
I like that. It's not a deal until we've agreed. That's something I'm going to have to keep in my mind.
PR people are the ones who screw this up all the time, you know, mostly. So they'll say off the record and then just say a whole list of unbelievable things. And you're like, well, I have no choice but to publish this now. So just, you know, don't make that mistake. It's not academics who usually make this mistake. It's you know, PR people who either don't know or want to pretend.
Well, we have a couple of interesting questions in the chat. One of them is a little bit closer to this about you know, you had said the greatest gift to a journalist is to let them know they're getting the story wrong. But what do you do if the story's already been published? So academics do have a problem with the quote tweet slam dunk, which is like shoulda, coulda, woulda, never woulda let you say that. Usually if they've quoted you, you don't do it like that. You try to massage it in the background and say, oh, it wasn't exactly how I thought that was going to turn out. But yeah, like, is there a way that academics should or could have different and better protocol around engaging with journalists that maybe are writing about things that are happening in the field, but may not have the right or the same lens from which you do?
So I recently actually had a great experience with a researcher from Harvard. And we
don't blame me for everything that happens here.
Yeah,
okay.
But it turned out really well. And I will say that one thing that's really good is sort of make it clear when you're talking to someone that you're open to like clarifying stuff. If you're sort of like, I don't want to say cranky, but if you seem unhelpful, then someone's not going to come back and make sure that they're contextualizing their quote properly. So like establishing a good rapport with a reporter who, to the point where you're like, if you want to just make sure that you have this right, like most good reporters aren't going to send you their whole story, but they may ask you to clarify things so that they don't get stuff wrong to begin with, right? That's assuming the best of intentions. And just like really making it clear that you're open to like helping and clarifying, I think is super important and really helpful. And just being available for a fact check like late at night, the day before the story runs or whatever is super nice. And I'm very grateful whenever people do that. But the other, I mean, and I don't know if I'm answering your question here, Joan, but I think that's part of it. In terms of fixing something which is already you think is wrong, I'll let Emily tackle that one or someone else.
Okay, I'll tackle it because I have been in my career both an editor and a writer. So in both of those jobs, the biggest fear that a journalist has is getting it wrong. Like our job is to get it right. Our job is to create or find and convey true and essential information. And so if we're getting something wrong in a story, like we've messed up at like the base of our job. So I've had to deal with this with writers of mine, like correcting a mistake or of my own. And I'll talk about a time that I got something wrong so now I'll do the embarrassing thing, Joan, I'll embarrass myself. I was reporting once about Section 230 of the Communications Act and also just about like whatever, controversies on the internet. And I spoke to this incredible scholar, I believe at the University of Miami, and she was incredibly gracious with her time. And what I wanted to do was try to give a history of how this, piece of text had been intended in the law and how that the use of it had changed, and I was trying to do a piece that was like context about this law, okay? But I'm not a legal scholar. And so this woman was a lawyer, she's an expert in this, she was super gracious with her time. We talked for a long, long, long time. And then I quoted her a bunch in the article. And I think I even went back to her and with one thing that I thought I didn't understand, she had clarified it, and then I published the article. And I got something wrong, like fundamentally, which was that she had been trying to make a point about the original intention of this law being one thing. And like, I got it like reversed in the article. And like, it's just mea culpa. Like I really messed up. I would have sworn, but we're recording this. And so I felt terrible. Like you can't even imagine how horrible I felt. But what she did was she immediately contacted me the second that it was published and said like, Emily, I don't know how this happened. Like we talked for so long, but you seem to have inverted this thing like in the nut graph in the most important part of your article. And she was really upset, because for her, this was going in Wired magazine. This is her area of expertise. She's being quoted in this. And I think what she was thinking was like, now this is going to be on record as me looking like an idiot, like at the thing that I'm the most smart about, that I'm the biggest expert in. And I felt so horrible, and I absolutely didn't want to have her be put in that situation. And so what I said to her was like, I want to fix it immediately. Let's fix it immediately. But clearly, since I misunderstood it, I don't easily understand how to fix it. Like what I don't want to do is get it wrong again, and so give you guys some transparency into what happens when in a situation like that. First, I had to tell my editor. Like the very first thing that happened was I told my editor I got something wrong, and this academic pointed it out, and I want to fix it. And then and so then they were aware. They started doing some research to see whether she was right, what had we all messed up. And then she and I got on the phone and, went line by line through what I had misunderstood. And she helped me understand better. And then I fixed it. I sent it back to her. The section that was in question, I sent it back to her for her to verify. And then we fixed it. And then we put a note at the very top of the article that said at this, or I think it was actually at the bottom of the article because, but we said like, when this article was originally published, it said this, and it should have said this. And, you know, that's how you deal with that problem. Like mistakes will be made. You know, nobody wants to make them, but they will occasionally be made. And if that anecdote is any like evidence, the journalist will remember it forever. Like every time I see that academic's name quoted, because she's a, you know, a very important academic, like I feel mortification about the time that that happened. But she and I have a good relationship now because she also knows that like I will always attempt to get it right and I would never do that again. So I think my advice for what to do if the story has already run and they've gotten it wrong is to contact the journalist immediately. Now there's two things that could be happening, right? One is that they could have misquoted you. Like they're saying you said something you didn't say. And that is, you know, you need to say that is not what I said or not what I meant. And another option is that they could have just got, and this is more what I had done, they misunderstood something in the conversation with you and then presented it wrong in like the context of the article. And that's not misrepresenting you, it's like misrepresenting the story. And I think sometimes academics might feel in that situation that that like it's outside of their scope to correct because it's not a quote of theirs that's being corrected. But if you know that this article was based on interviews with you and they got a fact wrong, you are absolutely empowered to contact them. And I would just say, you know, when you do so, remember that like they probably didn't get it wrong on purpose. They probably are about to be pretty embarrassed that they got it wrong and will want to work with you to correct it. You know, that's their job.
Yeah, I would just add to that, be nice. You know, like we're all on a deadline and we make a lot of mistakes. Like I'm not gonna lie, you get little facts wrong and you get context wrong. And I think if you're polite and you know respectful, you're gonna get better results than a more aggressive response, I'll say, in general. Just in life, I guess that's true. But you know, that's extra true when you're about to tell somebody that they totally screwed up at their job that they work hard at usually.
That makes sense. Michelle, do you have similar experiences with that? I you know, every once in a while they won't retract things on the radio, but they certainly will say a very funny story, which was basically I listen to a lot of talk radio, and you know, you never know what people are going to call in with, and I love a good hoax, and so I've always been drawn to those people that pretend to be, you know, the mayor calling in and are like, oh, school's shut down for today. And but how do you deal with things like that on the radio, where if it's a story where the context and everything is just off, or you got a bad sourcing?
Well, I would say everything that Mario and Emily have said, I would echo. Yeah, I don't have anything to add to that. But what I have found from my experience in terms of hearing from academics after the fact is often they have a very clear idea of how they would like to tell the story. And sometimes, and they often are not either happy with how the story came up, maybe because you mentioned the quote that was chosen, or that they weren't quoted at all, or they wanted you to go into far more detail. You know, it's radio. I had 1 minute and 40 seconds to tell a story about this report that you worked on for 3 years. And so that's something. And so I find that sometimes academics are fearful when dealing with a journalist, like, how are you going to handle my data? How are you going to handle my precious work? And there's that fear. And so often I find that in the process of being, you know, interviewing people, or even after the fact, or, you know, wanting to see the article before it goes, there's a lot of fear around, what are you going to do with my work?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that comes up for me. I mean, and this is something a fellow academic and I have talked about quite a bit. She deals with very complicated things around Bitcoin and blockchain, and sometimes you have to get pretty specific because it is all smoke and mirrors, right? And at the end of the day, explaining to someone a technology that is sometimes just magic, like literally people are making things up and like making up terms, and there's no there, it's just all vaporware, you know. And she gets into these positions where it's a really hard thing, where you want to balance the nuance with also getting the information out there that's true and correct. But it's hard because the complicated things don't get quoted. And then in her case, of course, she's not trying to sound smart, but she is trying to be technical. And as a result, it just doesn't come off well in print, because usually the quote that gets picked is sort of her laughing off what she just said because she had to say something so complex and difficult. And so I'd love to hear from you. And this also relates to a question in the chat from Wendy Chung about, and hey, Wendy, it's good to see you, if only virtual. Asked to do interviews as part of a new job as an academic, at a leading scholar at an institution, and but doesn't necessarily know if it's advisable to talk about work outside of the context of your expertise, right? There's in academia a lot of talk about staying in your lane. What could we do to talk with, and this also relates to another question from India at the beginning about making journalists aware of your expertise. Like, how do you get journalists to understand what's in bounds and out of bounds for what they might call you about? And then how do you also, through that process, maybe even a little bit of advice about getting sort of discovered if you do want to be interviewed? Emily?
I'll start with that. Okay, so in terms of getting, like, how should journalists know what you're an expert in? Mostly we are finding you from your university affiliation pages, because that's where your phone number and email is listed. And there's always a bio there, but I would really just make sure that your bio is emphasizing the like topical areas that you're into. And I mean, I hate to say like you should search engine optimize it, but really you should, because if there are phrases, and what I mean by that is just like, if there are topics you are an expert in and you want people to call you about, like let's say it's hate speech or disinformation, then you really should have hate speech and disinformation somewhere on your bio page. Because that's what's going to come up when we're searching, like literally academic or hate speech, like that's how we find you. Or we go through like the literature on, one of the other ways you find academics is that you're reading articles, like peer-reviewed articles, and then you call the authors of those articles. But having a personal website also can help you with that, because you can go into much more detail, and then that's also easy for us to find. But to Wendy's question about like staying in your lane and journalists asking you questions that you don't feel necessarily are on your beat, we talk about this a lot in the journalism world, because there's an observable trend, which is that male academics tend to say yes to interviews that may be far afield from their area of expertise, and female academics often will not. And in a situation where, like, okay, one of the times when I was calling a ton of academics, for instance, was during the period when there was a Muslim ban in the US, the quote unquote Muslim ban. And it was, you'll all perhaps recall this, it was deeply affecting academia. There were like postdocs, students, and professors who could not get back to their universities, or who were worried that they were going to be kicked out of the country. So I was trying to get information about like, how is this affecting your lab or your, course, or your TAs and your students? That's not really like anyone's expertise. I was just trying to ask about your experience as an academic, and all the people who answered me were men, and all the people who and all the women were like, I don't know anything about immigration, so I don't want to comment on this. So one thing I would just say is like, the reason to get quoted, right, is to raise your profile, and to establish yourself as a thought leader in whatever the sphere is that you are working in. And so you absolutely, I would say, shouldn't comment on things you know nothing about. That you don't need to do that, and you don't need to feel obligated to do that. But if it's something that you probably know, fair amount about, but it's not the focus of your main research, and it's an outlet that you respect, I would say, consider taking that call, because you can always, and you should always say to a journalist, like, I don't have direct experience with the thing you're talking about. My direct experience is over here, and it relates to what you're talking about this way. Just be honest and put it out there like that, and it may end up still being incredibly helpful. And the other thing it would be for you as an academic is just, it makes you a contact with a journalist. And then the next time that journalist is going to write about something that is your specific area of focus, then you'll know them, and it'll be easier.
I want to add too that, I've had, because I'm in a field where like journalism is a big part of the ecosystem, I've learned a lot from engaging with journalists just on background, even in my own work, because journalists that are on a beat are smart. I mean, they are. And the one thing that though I've observed is that if I do a good quote over in one place, journalists read each other's work. I don't know of any other field where people do this as often as I see in journalism, but journalists will call me and say, well, I saw you gave a quote to, X, and I love that quote, right? And so there's a kind of eye for that journalists develop over time, and there's quite a bit of back and forth talk with each other, I think, about which academics are open, and available, and other ones that there've been negative experiences with. And so, because there was another question about where journalists go looking for sources, and a lot of times it's also just other journalists, right? And that's part of the developing beat, is that that journalists will talk to each other about those different expectations and where to go for sourcing, for sure. Is there a way though that aside from like optimizing a bio and things that other academics might figure out a way to get involved? Is Mario, I expect too in the field of health that there's just a different dynamic for that kind of academic engagement.
Yeah, I mean, I think to one point that you say is, I'm a former editor. I'm sensitive to the source I've seen in everybody else's story. Like, I really don't want to see that very often. I usually tell reporters to go find somebody else. But I will say, like, I spend a lot of time looking at PubMD, your Google Scholar pages. And if it all looks like, especially in science, if it all looks like, if it's incomprehensible to me, like, I don't know, it's kind of hard. So what I would recommend if you have a specialty that is complex and includes lots of scientific terminology, write a commentary paper that describes what your story is actually about, or what your research is actually about, in some kind of context outside of like a bunch of Latin words, because it allows me to find what you're researching a lot easier. So that's one way that I would definitely recommend doing that. Definitely make sure there's something on your Google Scholar that resembles what you research in normal terms, because a lot of times the titles of academic papers don't say what is actually interesting about what you do. They're written in this way that is for other academics and not for normal people or journalists. I think having honestly, as much as I hate to say it, I think having a Twitter presence is like useful. It does. You'll see that people who have good Twitter presences are quoted a lot. It is a thing. It's a virtuous cycle. It reinforces itself. It leads to those people posting more on Twitter about the articles that they've been written on. That stuff gets distributed more, and that's how top experts like Joan Donovan wind up in lots and lots and lots of stories. Which is great. I would, if in the absence of a commentary article like that, I don't know to what degree like your university websites have capabilities for writing blog posts or anything that, again, state in more clear terms what it is that you actually do. Because a lot of times, the specifics of what your research is about and why it might be interesting to a normal person, which is what we are and a lot of times interested in, would not be clear necessarily from even, you know, as Emily said, from like your university bio, which is, you know, mostly used as an academic tool. So that's a number of ways, I'd say.
No, that's great. I mean, that really helps. And I think too, even people just, you don't have to necessarily run a Twitter account that's like mine, which is basically pictures of my cat and musings on when I'm really angry about, when I'm really frustrated with my writing is when I'll start tweeting, and I'll essentially be tweeting exactly what I should be writing. But it kind of clears the deck in my brain a little bit. But I think, yeah, the Twitter presence, I've even seen academics set up a bit of an automated, you know, sends articles from certain websites and different updates if they update their blog or their bio, but it isn't robust by any means, but it does definitely point directly back to you and your expertise. Really interesting question from Nelly in the chat about the expectation of journalists if they ask you to write an op-ed on your subject of expertise as opposed to interviewing. Especially because an op-ed requires you to kind of clear the desk, you know, take the kid to the radiator, tell your spouse you never want to see them again, get your pajamas on and write till 4 a.m. Because they want it tomorrow. That's usually the rules of a good op-ed, is that it's timely. Most academics don't have an op-ed written that they're just waiting for a news hook, like, which is to say that that's the fancy journalism lingo for something happened that's relevant to this argument I always make. So you could pre-stage an op-ed by having 800 words written on a topic that you know eventually someone is going to do something dumb, and could provide the pretext for that opening paragraph that basically just says something really messed up happened in the news, and here's all my scholarship that told you this was going to happen. Or not all my scholarship, but here's a good chunk of the arguments I make in my book that you're never going to read anyway. So, but op-eds are hard because not every outlet pays for them, but you should always ask for money because that's extra. It's not service work, for instance. You can pitch op-eds, and I highly recommend the services taking the course of the op-ed project, which taught me how to write op-eds, because an op-ed is like a recipe. If you do it well, it's got the news hook, it's got the who I am and why I can make the best argument. Then it has 3 strong points that you want to make that are an argument. You don't want people coming away from the op-ed believing you. You want them to have an idea about the whole topic area, but then why you're right, you know, and sometimes why everybody else is wrong. And then you want to close with something that is strong, either a kicker or a call to action. But in op-ed, you don't usually go and seek quotes. You rely on either your experiential expertise, like what Emily was talking about earlier, where you would say, I'm an academic and I care about this issue, or I'm a mom and I care about this issue, or I'm a doctor and I care about this issue. Or it's more of a research theme op-ed, which Emily had a screamer of an op-ed that we did in the New York Times earlier, or I guess it was later last year, about Twitter banning the search term Biden crime family and all the different ways that media manipulators went to go around that. But yeah, like an op-ed being asked, it's very likely it's going to get published. The other thing that happens is not so nice, which is that you pitch an op-ed and they take it and then you write it and they're like, I don't think so. You know, and so it's never published till it's published, I can tell you that much. But usually it's a really good sign if a good outlet is eliciting an op-ed. Emily, do you want to talk a bit about your experience moving from journalism into the research world and writing op-eds in a different tone?
Yeah, and I think, you know, one of the questions, one of the parts of this question is like, what's the expectation of writing an op-ed on you, and why would a journalist ask you to write an op-ed as opposed to just interview you? And, you know, I mean, I think I used to be the op-ed editor at Wired, and why would I reach out to someone and ask them to write an op-ed as opposed to interviewing them? I mean, number one, the person asking you is probably an editor, and so they're not in a position where they would be someone who would normally interview you. So there's certainly situations wherein like you could be asked to write an op-ed and you could also be interviewed by someone who's doing a news story, because these are separate like outputs. But the reason you'd be asked to write an op-ed is because of the belief that you are the expert and you might have enough to say that you should be given the chance to say it directly to the audience, and that the audience would appreciate that. That's the like reason for asking you, to say that like in this situation, you may have so much to offer that we don't need to mediate it with a journalist who's gonna, you know, ask you a bunch of questions and then put it in their words. You can just put it in your own words. So usually it's a sign of respect. And what I would say is like, why do it? You know, as Joan says, it takes forever. And sometimes you're busy, and you certainly don't have to do all op-eds at all. You know, you really don't have to. But as Mario was saying, you know, if you can find a chance to put your work into normal language and approachable language, you should take it, because that's how your work will reach a much wider audience outside of academia. And I think that the benefit and reason to do op-eds is because that's what they do. They force you, even if it's on a specific topic, because like you're commenting on the news or whatever, in some ways it'll obviously relate to your work, because that's why you're being asked to do it. And so it's a demonstration of the way in which your important scholarship can be applied to something real. And it shows that you can communicate it to a wider audience. And, you know, frankly, like op-eds will then be the thing that people find of yours. So that's something to bear in mind as well. Like, certainly don't write an op-ed that you don't believe in, or that you are like, I feel on the fence about this, I'm not sure I want to go on the record about it. Like, don't do it then, because it'll be in your name and it'll probably get a lot more viewership than your article that got accepted into Nature Communications, because like more people read the New York Times or whatever, you know? So bear that in mind, but that's also the reason to do it, because you'll reach a wider audience. You may get collaborators from it. You may get other journalistic opportunities from it. And so I would just see it as like, it's gravy. Being offered to do an op-ed is like, you can make of it what you will, like make the most of it or don't. You don't have to do it. But if you do it, like it can benefit you.
Yeah, and if you want to be quoted in every story about a topic forever, write an op-ed about it somewhere, you know, recognizable, and it'll happen for years, like for years. Also, I want to plug, we have a whole op-ed section, First Opinion, which is edited by Pat Scarrett. It's great. We run like 3 or 4 of them a day sometimes. So if you have pitches, please pitch them. first.opinion@statnews.com. So thanks.
Well, let me, no, Mario, I want to ask just to shape it in a little bit. Like, let's get into this a little bit too. Michelle, chime in here. Like, what outlets are good to pitch to? You know, obviously nobody's getting in the New York Times first go around. They really value people who are densely networked and whatnot. But, you know, for Stat News, what would make a good pitch?
Something topical about health and medicine. Obviously, we're getting a lot of pitches about COVID-19 right now, which is great, and it's an important topic. But I would say, you know, I mean, pitch your expertise in a way that normal people would. I mean, for a publication like ours, which is very much targeted at people who are in the know about the topic, right? You know, it's people who know about science, who work in the business, who are in pharma, who are decision makers in DC about policy on these topics. So, you know, I would say find the publication in your subspecialty, which is, you know, likely to be, I don't know what it would be for, if you're like an academic about international politics or whatever, go to Foreign Affairs or whatever, you know, the next version, you know, the easier to get into version of that is. I don't know what it is. I apologize to everyone in that field. But it, you know, like look for the publications that you read, I would say. You know, what is the stuff you like to read? And if you only read the New York Times, then, you know, work really hard to make friends with an editor at the New York Times, I guess.
Yeah, I know. And I think, like, you know, other places like the Conversation and Journalist Resource, even at Shorenstein, are good places for academic pieces where you don't actually have to learn how to talk in a different register, because writing for NBC News is very different than writing for the top tier journal in your field. You have to be able to break it down in what I call normal speak, which is like I try to have someone in outside of my field read something so that it's comprehensible. But Michelle, what do you think? Where, if someone was just getting started, where might they try this out?
Just pitch us. I think I work in a smaller station, so that we're not a very big newsroom, but I find that people don't pitch us enough. And so, or the people that do pitch us are doing what you call spray and pray, which is like you just send everybody the same email and hope for the best. But it's not often that a journalist will come to you and say, and if you happen to be studying otters on the Monterey Bay and you found this great thing about this new thing about them, write to us and we are likely to be very interested. But I don't often get academics who write to us and pitch us as much. This is for smaller newsrooms, of course, but if we want to hear from you, if it's relevant. A lot of the time, someone will write to me and it'll be like completely irrelevant, not relevant. So before doing that, who are you writing to? And, go to your smaller stations, because they would love to, do the local news. Are you, at a small, at UC Santa Cruz or CSUMB? Like, we want to hear about those stories. So it's actually, at the end of the day, it's just confidence to pitch. And also have a go at pitching with a friend before you do it, perhaps, because it's likely if you send me an email and I'm like, ugh, I have to Google a few of those things first before phoning this academic. That's not a great start, but it looks interesting. Me call you, and if we're on the phone for 30 minutes and I still don't know what it's about, I don't have a beat. One day I'm, covering the coronavirus, the next day I'm covering otters. So, practice maybe your pitching before you have a go at it, and have the confidence to do it as well.
No, that's a really good point, because I do see, Harvard, lots of people do op-eds in the Boston Globe. And, out at UCLA and USC, I see people doing op-eds in the LA Times and everywhere in between. And so it's a good way to get started and to definitely carve out a little bit of space for oneself. My first op-ed wasn't with, I'll never forget it. It wasn't really an op-ed at all. It was a piece for the Social Science Research Council. And it was about my Occupy research. And I was just so overwrote it. I think they asked me for 800 words. They might have gotten 16,000 at some point. I mean, I'm not even over exaggerating. I was just so excited that somebody wanted to read something that I had to say, especially at the Social Science Research Council, which is, unfortunately, Alondra Nelson's now moving on to bigger and different things over at the Office of Science and Technology Policy. But back then, 10 years ago, it was everything as a graduate student to be able to be published somewhere that wasn't obligated in some way to promote my work. And I took it really seriously. I honed that over the years and have learned that short is actually harder to write than long, and is often way more effective at delivering ideas, especially if you care about public understanding of the issue that you're knowledgeable about. And Christina asked a question about becoming comfortable with media requests over time. I still feel sick every time I got to talk to a journalist. I'm looking at 2 emails I have to write after this that involve talking to some journalists about another thing that makes me feel really nauseous, which is testifying in front of the Senate tomorrow. And I bring this up because, it's weird. I mean, it's really weird to be in this position. I joke about, just being a small town kid who ended up in college, but it's really kind of true, is like, education is this beautiful thing. And it's not about being self-interested. Like, for me, academia is about being able to explain ideas to the public. Like, that to me is the most important value that academics bring to the world. And journalists, for me, are over the years have come to be my closest companions in that mission. which is to say that journalists, if they're doing it right and they're doing it for the right reasons, care deeply about the dynamics, not just in terms of what the topic area is, but also within academia itself. I have never met more determined journalists than the ones in the health field, because they don't want to be putting up quackery and all kinds of stuff. And hoaxers, I'll tell you, hoaxers are pitching nonstop. The spray and pray, they almost invented that. And so and we saw with all these preprints, people putting up these false affiliations. Of course, it's always nice to claim that one works at Stanford, but we see the hoaxing around the Stanford affiliation is rampant when it comes to making claims about medicine and health. Which is to say that it doesn't actually get easier over time, but if you do develop relationships with journalists that you can say to them, all right, we're going really off the record here, and like you want to hear them, like you almost want to hear the click of the tape recorder if we were in the before times, where you can assure that. But over the years, I found that the quest for truth, there's a certain kind of person that is really dogged about that. And journalists, people don't get into that profession thinking, oh, I'm just going to write a bunch of puff pieces. They get into it because they really care about the topics at hand. And so, yeah, so that's how I feel about all of this, is that you get more comfortable with the people, but not with the actual apparatus. But I encourage people to add some more comments or questions into the Q&A. And then Emily?
I was just gonna go ahead and answer Blair's question about where do reporters go for sources. So it depends, but LinkedIn is a place. So even if you don't care about LinkedIn.
I don't have a LinkedIn.
Well, Joan, I think you don't need to do it.
Good.
I know, but my wife tried to set one up for me. It's hard. LinkedIn was hard.
LinkedIn it's really annoying, and like, to be honest, you really don't need it for like building your professional network, and it seems like in academia it's especially irrelevant. But in terms of journalists finding you, like sometimes a journalist will just be searching within LinkedIn for someone who works in some field, and so if you list your job and like you list what it is you do there, then now you're on another search engine that they're using. Twitter as well. Like, I think that academics, my husband's an academic, and I know there's some pressure on academics to like build up a Twitter presence. And then it's like, I don't have time for this. I'm literally writing grants and teaching classes and trying to do research, and you also want me to tweet? Like, what's going on here? You certainly don't really need to tweet. If you have a Twitter account that has your bio on it and a photo so you don't look like you're a bot, then it also
or a Russian spy.
Yeah, it just helps kind of the verification process of knowing that you're a person, and it's just another way of finding you, because journalists do frankly really rely on Twitter. But I mean, the main way I do it is whatever topic I'm reporting about, I try to figure out what institutes are like, or institutions are studying that, or maybe are the most respected in it. And that I do by like Googling, and then I'll go like, I know Berkeley, for instance, has a great linguistics department. And so if I'm writing, I used to write about like linguistics online. Sometimes I'll just start by going to Berkeley's Berkeley linguistics web page, scrolling down, and in the bios, it'll be like, I am a psycholinguist, I am a lexicographer, and like I'll try to figure out which of these people might be the one who would know, and start there. And then the other thing to do is what journalists do is we'll call the one academic we know is kind of nearby the field and say to them, like, I'm doing a story about heart transplant valves, and I know you're a cardiologist, like, who should I call that knows about heart transplant valves? And then get advice from others. So that's the other, to go back to I think it was Wendy's question that was like, should I talk to journalists? I mean, sometimes journalists are calling you because they want to know who is the right expert to call. Like they've Googled around. There's also these lists that we share with each other because we really try to have robust and good sourcing for these stories. So there's some lists that are like lists of experts that I think there's one put on by like Cold Spring Harbor has like a list that they share, and it's about like women in science if you're trying to diversify your source list. And all of which is just to say that, you know, you can say I'm not the right person, but call these two people. And that's such a beneficial and wonderful thing to do. Oh yeah, and I see you do that. That's great. I mean, if you feel like you really are the wrong person and you know who the right person is, that's the right response.
Yeah, you can always treat it like an op if you need to. Yeah, like what Wendy does, which is like say no, but then recommend someone. And I think that the same goes for academic conferences at this stage, which is if you get an opportunity to offer up somebody who has much more contextual knowledge and is junior, even better. I have a philosophy around, you know, lift as you climb, which is to say you really want to try to bring up all the folks with you that are going to support the field and support the right kind of context, because ultimately, you know, and like maybe this is where we should start to kind of bring the ideas a bit to a close here, which is the broader question here around, you know, journalism in the public interest. You know, journalism is here as a public good, even though we have to wrap it in you know, paywalls or subscription services or donations or have a bake sale for journalism. It's such an important way in which the public knows what's happening in academia, and especially when it comes to academia, where we often get stuck in this position where like we've known this for a decade, right? Like if you had asked Siva Vadarapian about Facebook 10 years ago, he would have saw this coming, right? When it comes to like, you know, groups coordinating using their networks to drum up fake engagement and to try to overthrow the government. It wasn't that hard to telegraph that from the perspective of social movement scholarship and technology like 10 years ago. And so here we are now in a position where a lot of people are like, well, I don't know, you know, corporations say it's not their products, and these people say it's not us, and journalism's over here just trying to piece all the puzzle together. And so it's really important to have critical voices in the press that can shape public knowledge and public understanding, especially of science and technology, because there is so much hope and hype out there when it comes to technology in particular. And so, you know, as we think about this, you know, for you all, as academics are learning to be more vocal and more present in these fields, what advice or what would you want them to take away from the conversation that we've had here today and the possibilities for changing these dynamics in the future? Which is to say that I think we've given a lot of really great practical advice. One other piece that I'll add to the conversation is if you want to increase your risk of getting quoted, decrease the amount of time that you're going to spend with the journalist, because there's a lot, you tend to be a lot sharper and faster as an academic if you know that you're on a clock and you want to just like deliver the knowledge, but at the same time be kind, in the sense that you also want to make sure that the journalist has what they need to write a really good story. And I'll answer one other question in the chat, which is to say that you know, standard practice, it is standard practice, at least for me, in high stakes stories, to ask for the text of a publication and to ask them, you know, basically to send a little quip about which quote of mine they're going to pick. Usually I do that for publications like the Wall Street Journal, because I know that they might interview people that I don't necessarily agree with, and I want to be very careful about where and how I'm quoted. But for other pieces where I have a better rapport with the journalist, and that I've seen them write about a certain thing 100 times, I ask less. But anyway, the big picture question is, you know, where should academics go from here if they want to be more engaged with journalism, and how can we be better partners with journalists?
Okay, I'll start. I just want to add one caveat to what you just said, Joan, about requesting your quotes, which is that certainly academics shouldn't feel like hesitant to ask that, but some places will say no as a matter of policy. At Wired, for instance, like we used to have a policy. I don't know what the policy is there now, but there was a policy against ever sending a piece to a source for review. There could, under certain circumstances, be the allow you to take the quotes from the piece and literally send those just to make sure it was like transcribed.
Yeah, that's
correctly.
what I'm talking about. My quotes.
Yeah. So that is much more normal. And I think we had a question about that. Like, is it okay to ask for the whole article? I mean, you can try, but it's taboo within journalism to do that. And most places will say no. And that's because there's a sense that like, we don't want the story to be entirely shaped by a source. Like we're supposed to be the objective person who's gone out and gathered a bunch of information, including the interview with you. And we're putting that together to present a truth. So that's where that comes from. What should they take away from this, and how can we be better partners? I mean, I guess the thing I always want to say to academics is just like, I think that there's a lot of fear, and some of the questions we got were that like, it's scary to be approached by a journalist, and it's scary to be thinking that your work will be taken out of context. And, those are the things where it goes wrong that you're worrying about. But in most cases, interacting with a journalist will go well. And we really aren't like, we're trying to be your partner in helping the information that you are creating and gathering within the world of academia reach a larger audience. So, I can, like how Joan was saying that she sees journalists as like her allies in having knowledge reach people. That's exactly how I feel about academics. Like my job as a journalist is to try to explain the world and tell people what they need to know in order to navigate the world so that they can live and like make sense of it. And I see like some of my biggest partners in that role are academics, because that's also what academics are doing. So I think the most important thing is just like view us as your buddies and your pals who are on the same mission with you, like we have the same mission. And then to the question, like, how can you, Catherine, I'll answer your question really quickly because I think this is part of it. How can you make sure the thing you want to talk about is the thing that gets quoted? Well, first of all, you could just talk about that thing. And that's the only thing they could ever quote you on. But also, I think Mario mentioned this earlier, write down some of your like main points before you do the interview. And if there are a couple of things that are the drumbeat that you want to get across, repeat them and like say them over and over again until they sound good. And just then a journalist will realize that's the thing you're getting at. And it's also okay and even great if you have some like standard lines that you use. Like if there are some really standard takeaways from your research, which is that like, this is how this works and it's always how it works. And that's what my research is. You can say that thing in every single interview. And it might not always get quoted, but if it does, I mean, I think for your benefit, it helps to show that like you as a scholar have a point of view. And this is where it is and it's consistent. Okay, I'll pass on.
Very cool. Michelle, did you want to go next?
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think earlier you said Emily used approachable language. And I think that for someone who works in radio, that is the biggest thing. Have you said this out loud to your grandma before? Have you practiced this on a 5th grader? Because people listening to the radio are often doing something else at the same time. You may be driving. And so we only have one chance to make sense of it. So have you practiced it? Have you got rid of your jargon? If I can't pronounce it on the first try, then it's not going to be usable perhaps. And, I love it when an academic says the sentence, think of it like this, and then goes blah, 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 blah. Because that's often, summarizing it or making it palatable to me, easy. So that's the best thing that you can do for a radio journalist, is to give us that approachable language that you kind of practiced before, because you're just going to make our lives really easy. And then someone might hear you in your awesome quotes and be like, I'm going to book this person for Science Friday and we'll have an in-depth, interview. And so approachable language, 100% is my biggest tip for speaking with a radio journalist.
Very cool. Mario.
Well, first of all, I want to say to the trepidation bit, I had to do my first radio story in like, I don't know, several years, a couple weeks ago. And I was being interviewed. I was so nervous. It ruined my entire morning. So I will just say that it's totally normal to be nervous when you're being interviewed. I frequently am super, super nervous before I call somebody who is like way more expert than I am about something. So keep in mind that the person on the other end of the call is frequently in the same boat as you in terms of feeling, maybe a little uncomfortable in the situation, because they're asking you about something that you know the most about. It's take sauce. It's like imagine the audience in their underwear kind of situation. But the other thing I would say, I think one of the earliest things that Joan said today was about, we can have a conversation about, why your quote didn't end up in the story, or like how you can get quoted in the story. And I guess, if a lot of this conversation has been sort of oriented toward this idea that like you have something to gain, right? By talking to reporters, and I'd hope that we have convinced you of this. Like, please talk to me when I email you about the story that I'm on deadline for. And I would appreciate that. But, I think it gets to the broader question of like, refer your academic colleagues who may be better suited for this. Please share tell me which study of yours I should look at if I don't know what this, like, the more that we can make this a collaborative like search for truth, and that we can have like an authentic relationship to like the actual goal of both your research and like what we are trying to do, the better off we're all going to be. Like, and I feel like if all you do is chase that one quote, like it may work, but you may end up being the person who's like quoted 9 million times, like not really ever about your research. Like if you have a good, authentic relationship with reporters and like tell them what they need to do, point them in the right direction, you'll get quoted, you will become well known for this stuff. So it's just like, I'd like to, as much as possible, just reinforce the notion that like, I don't know, we're all kind of just trying to make sense of like this unbelievably confusing world. And so, we can help each other. That's how I put it.
I like that. I mean, we can help each other. And I think there are benefits from both journalists and academics to being in more close contact, especially as, the public understanding of science and technology is such an important thing for all of us in the public right now because of the way in which the algorithmic economy works and how information gets in front of us, and what we trust about news has changed so much in the last decade, as well as watching sort of the slow death of local news. As much as we try to resuscitate it, it's things are shifting. And one of the big calls to action, I think, at the Shorenstein Center over the next, however long I'm there till I die, hopefully, is going to be, mission driven, focused on making sure that people have access to timely, local, relevant, and accurate information on demand. And so for us, it's very important that academics get out there and utilize journalism to the best of our field's abilities. And then hopefully over time, journalists will stop working in PR and get back to reporting. That would be, that's the hard part of it, is we didn't even get to talk about J School. But if you don't get a job as a reporter, you're writing copy for ads and PR statements. And so nobody needs that right now anyway. We do need more effective journalism and a kinder, I think, approach between journalism and academics would lead to less skepticism. Developing partnerships leads to less feelings that one has been scooped. And, there's no greater compliment in the world, though, that someone calls you up or emails you out of the blue and says, I think you have something smart to say. And so I think that that academics have a lot to learn about how news gathering works and how journalists are really good journalists, the ones that I've worked with over the years on the tech beat, I mean, nobody's going to fool them. There's going to be a lot of stuff they can't print because it's hard to substantiate, but it is remarkable the kind of stuff that they've been able to unearth. And I think, you know, local journalism as well, that those insights around what's happening in people's towns and the particularness and the color that we get in our society that allow us to aggregate a national publication or a national public conversation about issues, I think is really what holds us together as a nation and as a country and as a globe. And so I really see journalism as the glue here that is holding, you know, duct tape and glue it's good, but it's a good tool by me still. So I'm going to bring this to a close just by saying thank you for everybody that sat tight. We'll publish this recording a little bit edited so that you don't get all the banter at the beginning. And then there'll also be a tip sheet that Dwight's going to put together for everyone so that there'll be a crystallization of all these. And then hopefully Michelle and Mario, you'll come back and join us sometime at Shorenstein. Happy to bring you out for a cup of coffee and you know, talk about the good old days when you know, when reporters were eating steak dinners on the company dime.
Totally, yeah.
Awesome.
Anytime.
I'm kidding. That's for a different generation. One that does tend to come to Harvard quite a bit. Okay, that's
yeah, we miss that. We miss the heyday.
Yeah, we miss the heyday. That should be like the title of my next op-ed, right? We miss the heyday. But thank you everybody for joining, and Emily, Michelle, Mario, it's been a pleasure, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you.